The Vethari Claiming Festival happened once every 7 years, and Princess Kael'vora attended it the way she attended all imperial ceremonies, as furniture. She stood at the edge of the grand pavilion on the orbital platform Tessarin Station, dressed in the silver and midnight blue of House Kael, her fourth set of arms folded behind her back in the formal resting position her tutors had drilled into her since childhood. Around her, the great noble families of the Vethari Empire moved through the crowds with their claiming tokens clutched in their upper hands, small crystalline discs that, when pressed against a slave's claiming collar, would initiate transfer of ownership. The claiming festival was not considered barbaric by anyone who mattered. It was called, in the official histories, a cultural exchange through voluntary labor bonding. The word slavery had been illegal to use in the empire for 300 years, not because the practice had ended, but because the empress at the time had found the word aesthetically unpleasant. Kael'vora found the whole thing exhausting. She was not here to claim anyone. She was here because her mother, the High Empress, had decided that a 24th birthday celebration for her third daughter should take the form of a public appearance at an imperial event. It would not do for Princess Kael'vora, the daughter of the Silver Court, the blade heir of House Kael, holder of 17 minor titles she could never remember, to spend her birthday reading strategy codices alone in her tower. "You have a duty to be seen," her mother had said. "You are not a scholar, you are a princess. Act like one." So here she was, being seen, deeply, profoundly, and sincerely wishing she were not. The claiming pens occupied the lower level of the pavilion, a vast hall of translucent partitions behind which the bonded laborers waited beings from dozens of species, acquired through the empire's various conquest campaigns and debt slavery provisions. Vethari nobles drifted past the partitions with studied disinterest, the way one browsed a market while pretending not to want anything. Kael'vora had made it precisely halfway through her obligatory circuit of the hall when the accident happened. She was turning to avoid a particularly aggressive matron of House Velnar, a woman who had been trying to introduce her to her eligible son for the past 20 minutes, when she collided with a servant carrying a tray of claiming tokens. The tokens scattered. Kael'vora, whose reflexes were those of a trained warrior scholar, managed to catch 4 of them before they hit the ground. But her fifth hand, she had 6, an arrangement that was considered quite elegant among Vethari, caught the edge of one of the pen partitions for balance. The partition was a divider between the viewing corridor and the pen interior. It was not supposed to open. It opened. Her momentum carried her forward 2 steps into the pen before she caught herself, and in that 2-step stumble, her outermost left hand, the one still gripping 2 of the scattered claiming tokens, made contact with something warm and solid. A collar, a bonded laborer's claiming collar. The crystalline disc activated on contact, as it was designed to do. Transfer protocols initiated. The collar's identification node pinged the festival's central registry. And Princess Kael'vora, third daughter of the High Empress, accidentally claimed a human. The human looked down at his collar, then up at her, with an expression she had no cultural framework to interpret. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, unusually tall for a human, which she knew only from the Empire's extensive files on the species. The Vethari averaged around 2 meters. This one came nearly to that height, which put him at the upper range of human variation. He was lean in a way that suggested function over comfort, with pale skin darkened by sun on his forearms and neck, and hair the color of old copper that was somewhat longer than seemed practical. His eyes were the thing that arrested her attention. They were a shade of green she had seen exactly once before, in a bottle of Ethian sea glass her elder sister had brought back from a diplomatic mission. Pale green, almost translucent, with a quality of absolute stillness that she associated with people who had made a specific decision to wait. He was looking at her collar-reader hand with an expression she eventually identified as unsurprised. "You didn't mean to do that," he said. His Vethari standard was accented but fluent. "It was not a question." Kael'vora was the third daughter of the High Empress. She had been trained since the age of 4 to never show confusion, never admit a mistake, and above all never acknowledge that anything had gone other than exactly as she intended. "No," she said, "I did not." He considered this. "So what happens now?" She had absolutely no idea. The claiming was registered. The festival protocols were clear. A registered claim could not be undone on the festival floor, only transferred or formally released. And formal release required a 3-day administrative process that would involve her name, her seal, and a public record that the third princess of the empire had accidentally bonded a human laborer, and then let him go. Her mother would hear about this within hours either way. But there was a significant difference between her mother hearing, "Kael'vora accidentally claimed a human and immediately released him," and "Kael'vora accidentally claimed a human, followed 3 days later by quiet paperwork." The first story was humiliating in a memorable, repeatable way. The second was simply a footnote. "You will need to come with me," she said, "until the administrative period concludes." He looked at her for a long moment with those seagless eyes. Something moved through them that she could not name. "All right," he said. His name was Davin Reth. She learned this from his bonding records on the transit back to the imperial homeworld Vethara, sitting in the passenger cabin of her personal Corvette while he sat across from her in the laborer's seat, and she pretended to review documents on her data slate. He had been bonded for 11 years, taken in the 6th Margin campaign when he was 23, when the Empire had rolled over the outer human colonies with the predictable efficiency of something much larger stepping on something much smaller. His file described him as laborer class, physical designation, 7 citations for insubordination, no citations for violence, previous owner House Velnar, previous use, exhibition combat. Exhibition combat. She read the entry 3 times before she set the data slate down. "You were a fighter," she said. It was not meant to be a question either. He had been looking out the viewport at the stars, and he turned to her without hurry. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since I was bonded." She did the calculation. 11 years. The Velnar family kept fighters for their private arena circuits. She had attended 2 such events in her life, at her mother's insistence, and had found them deeply boring, not because she objected to the violence, which was a sensation she had trouble accessing, but because the outcome was predetermined in all but form. The fighters were bonded. They fought for their owner's entertainment. There was nowhere to go and nothing to become. 7 insubordination citations, she said. "Yes." "What did you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "The first time I refused to perform an injury that wasn't part of the match. The opponent was already down. The crowd wanted something more theatrical." A pause. "The next 6 times were variations on that." Kael'vora set down her data slate. "You refused to injure someone who was already defeated." 7 times. She looked at him. The laborer's seat was not designed for comfort. It was lower than the passenger seat, a deliberate architectural choice that expressed hierarchy without requiring anyone to state it. Davin Reth sat in it with the posture of someone who had made a long study of how to occupy diminished spaces without being diminished by them. "That's either principled or stupid," she said. "My previous owner thought it was both." He paused. "She wasn't wrong." Against her will, something shifted in Kael'vora's chest, an unfamiliar sensation that she would later recognize as the first cell of something new, beginning to change. Part 2. The Tower. The Kael family's primary residence on Vethara was called the Silver Spine, a tower complex of extraordinary height and extraordinary coldness that had been in the family for 12 generations. Kael'vora had lived in it her entire life, and had never once felt that it was home. It was a beautiful, efficient, perfectly maintained monument to the power of a family that prioritized beauty, efficiency, and power maintenance above all other things. She put Davin Reth in the East Wing's secondary quarters, the rooms assigned to skilled personal retainers, which was several grades above where festival-claimed laborers were typically housed, and which she told herself was a practical decision. The administrative period was 3 days. There was no reason to introduce additional complications. He did not comment on the room assignment. He did not comment on much she was beginning to notice. He observed. He answered when spoken to, directly and without decoration. He moved through the Silver Spines corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that visibility had costs. On the first morning, she found him in the East Wing's small garden, a narrow strip of cultivated plants that her grandmother had maintained, and that had survived the rest of the family's lack of interest through sheer botanical stubbornness. He was crouched beside a cluster of silver-leafed ground cover, looking at something she couldn't see from the doorway. "What are you doing?" she asked. "There's a fungal growth on the base of these stalks." He stood, unhurried. "It'll spread to the root system within a week if it's not treated. Does someone tend this garden?" "No one has for several years." He looked at the plants with an expression she was beginning to categorize as his thinking face, contained, quiet, working through something. "Do you have plant treatment supplies somewhere in the household?" She did not know, she said so. He found the supplies himself, by the direct method of asking the household's lower-level maintenance staff, which apparently worked better than anyone in the family had ever tried. By mid-morning, he was treating the fungal growth with precise, unhurried attention. She stood in the doorway for longer than she intended, watching him work. On the second day, her mother summoned her. The High Empress Kelsova received her in the formal audience chamber, which meant it was not a private conversation. 2 of her senior advisors stood against the wall. The Empress herself sat in the elevated chair that she sat in for all formal conversations, including, apparently, with her own daughters. "Tell me about the human," the Empress said. Kael'vora kept her posture exactly as her tutors had trained it. An accidental claiming at the festival. Administrative release will be processed in 36 hours. "Yes, I read the record." The Empress studied her with the flat, assessing gaze she turned on everything: economic data, treaty proposals, her children. 7 insubordination citations. A fighter. "Yes." House Velnar is not pleased with the transfer. Matron Velnar considered him a significant investment. The claiming was legal and registered. "Yes." The Empress's expression did not change. "I am not suggesting otherwise. I am noting that you have created a minor diplomatic inconvenience with a house we are currently negotiating trade terms with." She paused. "Your accident has become my administrative problem." Kael'vora said nothing. She had learned early that there was a category of her mother's statements that were not designed to receive a response. "The release will proceed," the Empress continued. "However, I would prefer it to happen quietly and without press attention. If the story circulates that my 3rd daughter stumbled through a festival pen and accidentally bonded a laborer, we will spend the next 6 months managing the narrative. I dislike managing narratives. They take time I would prefer to use for things that matter." "Yes, Empress. Take the time you need. Keep the human occupied and out of public spaces. And Kael'vora," the Empress's tone shifted just fractionally, "try not to make this more complicated than it already is." Kael'vora bowed and left. She did not ask what the Empress meant by more complicated. She told herself she didn't need to know. On the second evening, she went back to the East Garden. He was still there or there again, she wasn't sure which. The garden looked different. She couldn't immediately identify what had changed and then realized. It was lighter. He had cleared the dead growth from the outer edges. the dried stalks that had been standing as memorial to the last time anyone had cared about this space. Without them, the living plants caught the evening light differently. She sat on the low stone ledge at the garden's far end. This was, she recognized distantly, not a thing she did. She did not sit in the garden in the evenings. She did not sit anywhere without a purpose. "Does it bother you?" she asked. He was gathering the cleared stalks into a pile. He didn't look up. "Does what bother me?" "The collar," she paused, "the claiming being here." He was quiet for a moment. "You want an honest answer to that." "I asked for one." He set down the stalks and looked at her directly. "Being here is better than where I was. The collar has bothered me for 11 years. The claiming itself was an accident, and I don't hold accidents against people." He paused. "Is that what you wanted to know?" "No," she said. "I wanted to know if you were angry." "At you?" "At any of it." He considered this with the same unhurried attention he brought to the fungal growth, to the garden layout, to everything she had watched him do in 2 days. "Anger's a tool," he said finally. "It's useful for specific jobs. For getting through a day in the Velnar pens, staying angry would have cost more than it gave." "So you aren't?" "I didn't say that." He looked at the garden, not at her. "I said I don't spend it on things that don't earn it." Kael'vora sat with this for a while. The evening light was doing something interesting to the silver-leafed ground cover, catching it at an angle that made it look almost luminous. "What does earn it?" she asked. "Waste," he said. "Things that could be otherwise. Being allowed to stay broken, because changing them is inconvenient for whoever's in charge." The words landed with a quietness that made them hit harder than a shout would have. She looked at the garden, at the living plants uncovered now, catching light. She did not say anything else, but she stayed until the light faded. Part 3. What changes and what doesn't. The administrative release was processed on the morning of the 3rd day. Kael'vora held the paperwork in her upper 2 hands and the seal stamp in her lower left, and she stood in her study with the document that would undo a claiming that had lasted 71 hours and chain, nothing except return one human man to the category of unowned, which in the Empire's legal framework meant he would be available for claiming again at the next opportunity, unless he could reach a free zone border within 30 days. She read that provision 3 times. Free zone borders were not close. The nearest one was on the outer rim of the Tessarin system, 11 days of travel from Vethara on a transport he would need to pay for, with no credits because bonded laborers did not accumulate currency. The 30-day clock started from the moment of his release, and it did not pause for the logistical impossibility of the situation. She set down the seal stamp. She called her administrative secretary, a precise woman named Veltha who had managed the family's paperwork for 20 years and who was unshockable by personal policy. "The release document for the Reth bonding," Kael'vora said. "Yes, Your Highness." "What would it cost to process a free citizen designation in conjunction with the release?" Veltha's expression did not change, but she paused 1 beat longer than usual. "A free citizen designation for a bonded laborer requires a sponsorship seal from a member of a recognized noble house, a security bond in the amount of 4,000 imperial credits, and a formal declaration of sponsoring intent filed with the Imperial Labor Bureau." She paused again. "The security bond is returnable after 5 years of clean residency record." 4,000 credits was not a significant sum for House Kael. It was also not nothing. It was an intentional barrier, designed to make freedom difficult without making it formally illegal. "Prepare the documentation," Kael'vora said. "Yes, Your Highness." "And Veltha, do this through the East Wing administrative track, not the family main registry." Another pause. "Of course." She told him in the garden. She had noticed that he thought more clearly in the garden, or perhaps it was that she did, which was a more surprising observation. "The administrative release is finalized," she said. "You are no longer bonded to House Kale." He nodded, once, with the same contained stillness he brought to everything. "Additionally," she continued, "I have processed a free citizen designation. The documentation is filed with the Imperial Labor Bureau. You will receive a residency chip within 24 hours. You can remain on Vethara legally for as long as you choose. If you prefer to leave, the designation is portable. It's recognized in 17 of the Empire's 20 administrative sectors." He was very still. "Why?" he asked. It was a direct question. She had come to expect those from him. She had been a princess for 24 years and had learned to manage most conversations by keeping them in the territory of the decorative and the expected. He did not operate in that territory at all, and 3 days of exposure to it had done something to her ability to stay in it herself. "Because the alternative was releasing you into a situation that would have rebonded you within 30 days, she said. That seemed like a waste. He looked at her. The Seagless eyes were doing the thing she had come to recognize as him taking something apart to see how it worked. "You could have not processed the release at all," he said. "Kept me on staff, it would have been legal, easier." "Yes, but you didn't." "No." He was quiet for a long moment. Why not? She had been asking herself this for 24 hours. She had 17 answers, all of which were true and none of which felt complete. She gave him the one that was most accurate. "You told me that anger is wasted on things that could be otherwise but are allowed to stay broken because change is inconvenient for whoever's in charge." She looked at the garden, at the silver-leafed ground cover, luminous in the morning light, saved from a fungal death by someone who had noticed it needed saving. "I'm in charge of a great many things. I would prefer not to be the inconvenience in my own logic." He was quiet for even longer this time. "That's a strange reason," he said, "to change someone's life." "Most cells don't know they're changing the body," she said. "They just do what they do, and the change happens anyway." It was an odd thing to say, and she wasn't sure why she'd said it. But his expression shifted, something moving through the stillness, the way light moves through sea glass, and she thought it might have been the closest thing to surprise she had seen from him. Part 4. The complication. She had told herself it would not become more complicated. It became more complicated almost immediately, in the specific way that things become more complicated when a person makes a decision that is harder to explain than they expected, and then find themselves unable to stop explaining it to themselves. Davin Reth did not leave. This surprised her, though she told herself it shouldn't. He had a free citizen designation and nowhere established to go. Vethara was as good a starting point as any. He found work in the East Wing's maintenance operations, not because she arranged it, but because Veltha's maintenance coordinator had noticed what he'd done to the garden and made him an offer directly. It was low-level work for someone with 11 years of combat-coded physical training, but he did it with the same attentive precision he brought to everything, and within 2 weeks the East Wing systems were running better than they had in a decade. She noticed because it was her wing. She noticed other things too, which was more of a problem. She noticed that he was teaching himself Vethari script. She found him in the small library off the East Corridor twice, with a children's text balanced on one knee and a look of focused irritation that he usually wore while figuring out a stuck mechanism. She noticed that he had begun, quietly and without any announcement, fixing small problems throughout the East Wing that were not technically within his assigned duties. A drainage channel that backed up every third rain cycle, a solar collection panel that had been misaligned for 2 years, a hinge on the garden's outer gate that had been making a sound she'd stopped hearing because it had been there so long. She noticed that her staff had begun to interact with him differently than they interacted with most people, with the careful respect given to someone who makes things work and doesn't make a show of it. She noticed that she had started planning her morning to include the East Garden at the same time he worked there. She noticed that she was noticing. "You're spending time with the human," her eldest sister said. Kelsira was 8 years older than Kael'vora, beautiful in the razor-edged way of the family's main line, and possessed of the specific unkindness that comes from spending a lifetime as an heir in a family, where the top position was occupied by someone both very powerful and very long-lived. She had made an art form of the cutting observation delivered in a pleasant tone. "He works in the East Wing," Kael'vora said. "I live in the East Wing." "You're in the garden every morning." "The garden is in the East Wing." Kelsira smiled. It was a very controlled smile. "Mother is going to hear about this." "Mother already knows he's here. I filed the residency documents through the family system." "The East Wing subsystem," Kelsira said. "Which Mother doesn't monitor directly, and which you knew when you chose it." Kael'vora said nothing. This was true. "You know what you're doing," her sister said. It was less an accusation than a statement of interest, the way one observes an unusual chemical reaction. "I'm providing humane employment to a skilled worker who has nowhere else to start," Kael'vora said. "Is that all?" "That is all." Kelsira looked at her with the particular measuring gaze of a woman who had made a study of advantage and liability in all its forms. "He's a human, Vora." "I'm aware." "And a former bonded laborer." "Also aware." "With insubordination citations." "7 of them," Kael'vora said, "for refusing to injure a defeated opponent on his owner's command." "On 7 separate occasions." She held her sister's gaze. "I'm not sure that's a mark against him." The silence stretched. "No," Kelsira said finally in a different tone. "I suppose it's not." She was quiet for a moment more. "Be careful, Vora." It was, coming from her sister, the closest thing to genuine concern she'd received in years. She recognized it, even if she wasn't sure what to do with it. "I'm always careful," she said. She was beginning to suspect that careful was no longer the relevant variable. Part 5. The apoptosis. There is a process in biology, in human biology, she had learned from the Empire's extensive files on the species, obtained for strategic rather than intellectual reasons, called apoptosis. It is the programmed death of cells, not damage, not injury, a design process written into the cellular code through which a cell recognizes that it must end itself so that the organism can continue. It sounded like a loss. It was not a loss. The cells that undergo apoptosis are the ones that have served their purpose, or the ones that have become dangerous, or the ones that are blocking something new from growing in the space they occupy. Their ending is not subtraction. It is permission. She thought about this in the East Garden on the 40th day after the accidental claiming, sitting on the stone ledge in the morning light while Davin worked at the far end. He had taken on the larger project of restructuring the planting zones, giving the ground cover more space, adding a small water feature that one of the maintenance staff had found decommissioned in the deep storage, and that was now producing a sound she had not heard in the garden before. Running water. It was a small sound. It changed everything about the space. She thought about what was dying in her, what she was watching undergo apoptosis, quietly, without drama, without her permission exactly, or with it perhaps. The permission given not in a single decision, but in 40 consecutive mornings of choosing the garden over the schedule, 40 evenings of choosing an honest answer over a practiced deflection. 40 days of finding that the person she was most direct with was not a member of her court or her family, but a formerly bonded human man with sea-glass eyes, and 7 citations for refusing to be convenient. What was dying? The certainty that being a princess was a complete description of a person. The belief that her mother's assessment of what mattered was the same as what mattered. The habit of treating her own curiosity as a liability. The assumption that the system she had been born into was the same as the system that should exist. They were old things. They had served functions. They had kept her safe and useful and appropriately placed in the architecture of the empire. But they had also kept her in a position where she attended festivals as furniture and called it duty, where she spent her birthday being seen rather than actually living inside a day, where she had been managing her own life as a narrative for so long that she had nearly lost the ability to distinguish between what she actually thought and what she had decided to think. The new things were quieter. They had no names yet. They were the kind of thing that only exists in early form, a cell beginning to differentiate, uncertain of its final shape, certain only that the old shape was ending. "Tell me about the colonies," she said. He looked up from the water features drainage channel. "Which ones?" "The ones the Sixth Margin campaign took." She paused. "Your home." He was quiet for a moment. In the particular way he went quiet when he was deciding whether a question deserved a careful answer or an honest one. She had learned to read the difference. The careful answers were shorter. The honest ones took longer to arrive. "Sereth IV," he said finally. "It was a farming colony, 3 generations deep. My grandparents were in the first settlement wave." He went back to the drainage channel, working with his hands while he talked. "It wasn't much, 12,000 people. We grew grain cultivars that did well in the soil composition and exported a particular kind of fiber crop that apparently had applications in Vethari textile production." "Apparent and ongoing," Kael'vora said. "Sereth IV fiber is still used in the Silver District manufacturing sector." He paused. "I know," he said. "I looked it up in the household library." She absorbed this. He had looked up his own colony in her family's library. He had found out that the thing they grew there, the thing his family grew, 3 generations deep, was still being used, still being imported, still feeding a productive output, just without the people it had come from. "What happened to the colonists?" she asked, even though she knew. "Scattered," he said. "Bonded labor distribution. Most of the adults to work camps in the mid-sector, children to domestic programs." He paused. "My parents, I don't know where." The words were very simple. They did not attempt anything larger than what they were. She had a sudden and forceful image of what it cost to say them that simply. "Davin," she said. He looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not in the formal sense. Not as a representative of the empire or the claiming system or my family's interests. I'm sorry the way a person is sorry when they understand that another person has carried something very heavy for a very long time." He looked at her for a long moment. The seagless eyes were doing the thing she still couldn't fully name, light moving through them, slow and deep. "Thank you," he said. And then, quieter, "That's the first time anyone said that to me." She did not have a response for that. She sat with it instead, in the silence that had become familiar between them, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that 2 people make together without planning to. After a while, she did not track how long, she heard herself say, "I want to find them." He looked at her. "My parents." The empire has records of every labor distribution from the Sixth Margin campaign. They're in the Imperial Archive, sealed to public access, but not to members of the first 3 noble tiers. She looked at him steadily. "I'm a member of the 2nd tier by birth. I have access." He was very still. "You would look for them." "I would look for the records. Whether they contain anything useful depends on what the records contain." She paused. "I'm not promising an outcome. I'm telling you what's possible." The stillness in him was different from any of the stillness she had learned to read. This one had a quality she had no name for, like watching something hold its own weight very carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it was the only one holding it and it mattered. "Why?" he said finally. "Because you said you don't know where they are," she said. "And not knowing is a thing that can sometimes be changed by someone who has access to the information that resolves it. I have the access." He looked at the garden for a long time. At the silver-leafed ground cover, at the water feature running its small sound. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it a choice rather than a transaction." He did not say anything for a long time after that. She did not push. She had learned that his silences were working silences, that something was being processed, assessed, turned over, in the same careful way he turned over a stuck mechanism to find the point where force needed to be applied. Finally he said, "My mother's name was Sierra Reth. My father was Cam Reth. Sareth IV settlers. They would have been recorded in the 6th margin labor distribution under the regional batch code, which was SIV margin 6. She noted it in the small memorandum she kept for things that needed to not be forgotten. "I'll look tomorrow," she said. She did look the following day. The Imperial Archives labor distribution records for the 6th margin campaign were extensive. The Empire had, in its meticulous way, recorded every human it had bonded, down to their origin colony and initial distribution assignment. This was not done out of consideration for the humans involved. It was done because inventory management was an administrative imperative, and people, in the Empire's legal framework, were a category of inventory. The record for Sierra Reth, Sareth IV, SIV margin 6 showed a domestic services assignment to a mid-sector household in the Tessarin system. The same system as the festival platform, where Kael'vora had accidentally stumbled through a partition wall 72 days ago. The record showed a labor reassignment 9 years in, to a household in the Vethari homeworld's outer agricultural district. The record showed, under current status, deceased year 14 of bonding, cause recorded as illness. She sat with this for a very long time, in the archives reading room with the document lit on the screen in front of her, before she closed it and went to find the record for Cam Reth. Cam Reth's record showed a work camp assignment in the deep mid-sector, a reassignment at year 3 to a mining operation in the outer belt, a reassignment at year 6 to a different mining operation closer in. Under current status, active assignment, labor grade 3, Tessarin outer belt, compound designation TB compound 17. She sat with this for a different kind of long time. Then she closed the archive and went to find Veltha. "The Tessarin outer belt," she said. "What's the transit time from here?" Veltha's expression did not change. 11 days standard, Your Highness, 9 with a priority routing authorization. She thought about what she was going to say to him. She thought about how you told a person that you had found half an answer where they were hoping for a whole one. She thought about the weight he had been carrying, simple and unannounced, for 11 years. She went to the garden. Part 6, The Choice. The crisis arrived, as crises do, at an inconvenient time. It arrived in the form of a formal message from the Imperial Labor Bureau, addressed to Kael'vora's personal seal, delivered on the 44th day after the claiming. The message informed her that a review of the East Wing administrative track had been completed by the Bureau's Compliance Office, in response to a query from the main House Kael registry, and that the Free Citizen designation filed for Laborer Record D. Reth 7MX was under formal investigation. The grounds: irregular filing procedures, specifically the use of the East Wing subsidiary system rather than the main Noble House registry, and questions regarding whether proper sponsoring intent had been declared by an authorized member of the House's first tier. The message further noted that pending the investigation's completion, estimated duration 14 to 21 days, the subject's Free Citizen designation would be in suspended status, and he would technically revert to unregistered laborer classification during that period, making him vulnerable to reclaiming. She read the message 4 times. Then she looked up the definition of first-tier authorization for a Free Citizen sponsorship. It was, as she had suspected, a provision designed to require involvement from the family's primary hierarchy, not a third daughter filing through a subsidiary track. Someone had reported the irregular filing to the main registry. She thought about who had both the access and the motivation. She thought about Matron Velnar of House Velnar, whose exhibition fighter had been taken in an accidental claiming, and then quietly given a free citizen designation by a princess who had, apparently, not been quiet enough about it. She thought about her sister's words, "Be careful, Vora." She thought about 14 to 21 days of suspended status, and what that meant for a person who had spent 11 years bonded, who had earned 7 citations for refusing to be convenient, who had fixed the East Wing's drainage and treated the garden's fungal growth and found running water in the deep storage, and quietly, without any announcement, made everything around him work better simply by paying attention to it. She thought about the word waste. She went to see her mother that evening. Not in the formal audience chamber. She requested a private meeting, which was unusual enough that the Empress granted it out of something that might have been curiosity, in the small sitting room off the family's private corridor that was not furnished for hierarchy. 2 chairs, approximately equal in height, which was the closest the silver spine got to neutral ground. "The Labor Bureau investigation," Calvora said. "Yes," her mother said, "I was informed." "You initiated it." The Empress looked at her. The main registry flagged an irregular filing and referred it to the Bureau. That is the appropriate procedure. "You were informed of the filing before the Bureau was," Calvora said. "I know the East Wing system routes. The flag would have come to you first." A pause. "Yes. You chose to refer it rather than close it." "I chose to follow the appropriate procedure." "You chose," Calvora said, "to create 14 to 21 days of vulnerability for a person whose documentation you could have approved in 30 seconds with a first-tier seal." The Empress was very still. She had the kind of stillness that was related to, but fundamentally different from, Davin's stillness. His was the stillness of a person who had decided to wait, and hers was the stillness of a person who was deciding whether to respond to something that had surprised her. "You are very exercised about this laborer," the Empress said. "I am very exercised about the principle," Calvora said. "Which is that I made a decision, a considered decision, to do something that cost me almost nothing and cost him everything if undone. And that decision is being used as a pressure point." "By whom?" "By whatever combination of House Velnar's interests and your own concerns about a narrative have resulted in an investigation of a free citizen designation that is, by any reasonable legal standard, completely valid." The Empress looked at her for a long moment, the assessment gaze, the one she turned on economic data and treaty proposals. "He has changed you," she said. "I have been paying attention," Calvora said. "That is not the same thing as being changed." "Is it not?" She stopped, thought about cells undergoing apoptosis, thought about space being made. "No," she said. "It's not, but the attention is mine, the conclusions are mine." She met her mother's gaze steadily. "I would like you to apply a first-tier seal to the free citizen designation, today. And if I don't, then I will file a formal request for independent review through the Imperial Assembly's Civil Designation Committee, which will take 30 days rather than 14, but will not require your seal, and which will result in a public record of the review that will be substantially more visible than a quiet administrative correction." The silence was very long. "You've thought this through," the Empress said. "I've had 44 days to think about what kind of person I want to be." Another long silence. Then her mother made a sound that was, almost but not quite, a laugh. "I had your sister file through the main registry as a test," the Empress said, "to see what you would do." Calvora went very still. "A test of what?" she said very carefully. "Of whether you understood consequences, whether you were thinking clearly." The Empress looked at her with an expression that had something in it she hadn't seen before, something she would only identify later as a particular kind of pride, the kind that hides itself because showing it requires admitting you were uncertain, whether this was emotion or judgment. And you came here in the evening without your ceremonial arms, with a legal strategy prepared and a timeline estimated, and a clear argument that didn't involve telling me how you feel. The Empress paused. I would say that's both. She applied the first-tier seal the following morning. Interlude what he saw. Davin Reth had a specific and long-practiced skill for reading the architecture of a place. It had developed in the Velnar pens, where survival, not physical survival, which was guaranteed because a fighter with a broken body was an economic liability, but the survival of the part of yourself that remained yours depended on your ability to understand exactly what kind of place you were in, who held power in it and how, where the pressure points were, what was decorative and what was structural, which walls could be leaned on and which would fall if you pushed too hard. The silver spine was a complicated architecture. The obvious reading was straightforward, a monument to hierarchical power, designed in every detail to express that some people were higher than others. That altitude was a metaphor the House Kale had taken literally for 12 generations. The elevated chairs, the lower seats, the formal chambers reserved for statements that needed to be made with physical grandeur backing them up. Even the corridors were wider in the family's primary spaces and narrower in the staff sections, an architecture that told you, without saying anything, exactly how much space your kind of person was entitled to take up. He was familiar with that kind of message. He had lived inside it for 11 years. But the East Wing read differently. He had noticed it from the first day. The secondary quarters she had put him in, the rooms assigned to skilled retainers, were not the rooms a laborer fresh from a festival claiming would normally occupy. He had noticed the upgrade and said nothing about it, because saying something would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required her to either justify it or walk it back. And he had already understood from 20 minutes of observation in that transit cabin that she was a person who needed space to make decisions without being watched making them. So he had said nothing, and let her decision stand, and paid close attention to everything else. What he found, over those early days of paying close attention, was this. The East Wing was the only part of the silver spine that functioned the way a place inhabited by people actually had to function, rather than the way a monument to power was designed to appear to function. Somewhere in the last several years, he could estimate from the maintenance records he had quietly reviewed, the East Wing's upkeep had quietly defaulted to the staff's own initiative rather than formal oversight from the family's main administrative system. Veltha, the administrative secretary, had been running small decisions on her own judgment for at least 3 years. The maintenance coordinator had been prioritizing based on what actually needed attention rather than what looked good for inspections. They had been doing it because there was a third princess in residence who asked questions about the things she saw, rather than instructing people to ensure she didn't see things she would need to ask about. Small difference, total difference structurally. He had also noticed that the East Wing staff spoke to him differently than Velnar's staff had. Not kindly, necessarily. Kindness was not a workplace constant anywhere he had been, but directly, as if his response to a question was relevant information rather than a formality to be managed, as if they expected him to have competent answers and were genuinely interested in what those answers turned out to be. He thought about why, and arrived at, because the person they served treated competence as relevant information rather than a formality to be managed, and environments become versions of the people who set their tone. He thought about this a great deal, in the way that a person who has spent 11 years surrounded by one kind of environment thinks about the first place that feels different, not as a sanctuary, because he had learned not to count on places, but as a data point. evidence of something he had spent 11 years not being sure still existed. The possibility that a position of power could be occupied by someone who was genuinely paying attention to what it cost the people below it. He watched her over those 47 days. He watched her in the garden, where she came without ceremony and sat without agenda and asked questions that cost her something. The questions that required admitting she didn't know, that required sitting with the answer rather than routing it immediately into a decision. He watched her in the East Wing's daily administration, where she made small corrections to processes that no one would have noticed if she hadn't, because she had read enough to understand what correct looked like, and had noticed where existing procedures had drifted from it. He watched her read his bonding file on the transit ship with an expression she did not manage, that ran through her like light through sea glass, showing everything before she put the data slate down and composed herself. He had learned, 11 years ago, to stop expecting to be seen as a person rather than a function. He was discovering that unlearning an expectation was a different kind of work than acquiring one, harder in some ways, more disorienting. The thing you stopped expecting and then received had a quality of weightlessness that left you uncertain of your balance. He was uncertain of his balance a fair amount of the time during those weeks. He found that it did not stop him from moving forward. And he thought in the privacy of his own reasoning, which was the only territory that had always been entirely his, that what she was doing with herself, quietly and without announcement, was the same work, unlearning the expectation that power required you to stop seeing. Discovering, with the same disorienting surprise, that you could be both a princess of the empire and a person paying attention, and that being both was not a contradiction but a completion. He knew what this kind of change looked like. He had been watching it happen in himself for 11 years, the slow, cellular work of maintaining something intact under conditions designed to dissolve it. He recognized the signs in someone else. He recognized it. He did not say anything about it. Some processes needed to be allowed to complete without being observed. Part 7. What grows in the space? She told him all of it. Not immediately. She waited 3 days, until the investigation was formally closed and his designation reinstated without condition, and she was certain the story was finished before she told it. This was a calculated choice, and she knew it, and she told him that too. You waited to tell me until it was resolved, he said. They were in the garden, in the evening, which had become a time that belonged to neither of them specifically and both of them in general. A slow accumulation of evenings that had not been formally designated anything but had become the most honest hours of her days. Yes. Why? Because I didn't want you to spend 3 days not knowing the outcome, she said. The anxiety would have served no purpose. If it had gone wrong, I would have told you when I had something useful to tell you alongside it. He was quiet. That's a very practical form of consideration. I'm a very practical person. No, he said. You're a practical person who spent 40 years learning to call everything practical because it was safer than calling it what it was. She looked at him. What was it? She asked. He met her gaze with the sea-glass directness she had never gotten used to. Kindness, he said. You were being kind. The word sat between them in the evening air. It was not a word she used about herself. It was not a word that had been used about her much at all. There were sharper, more respectable qualities that the House Kale vocabulary preferred. Decisive, capable, strategically sound. I've been told it's a liability, she said. Who told you that? Various people over many years. She paused. They're not wrong, it can be. So can strength, he said. Doesn't make it not strength. She was quiet for a while. The water feature made its small, continuous sound. The silver-leafed ground cover caught the evening light. What happens now? She asked. It was the same question he had asked her at the beginning in the claiming pen. She had not answered it well then. She was not sure she could answer it now, but she asked it honestly and waited. He looked at the garden for a moment, at the work he had done in it over 47 days, the reclaimed spaces, the cleared paths, the water that ran where before there had been silence. "I don't know," he said. "I know what I want." He looked at her. "Do you?" It was the most direct question anyone had ever asked her. She had been asked what she thought, what she planned, what she intended. She had not been asked what she wanted by someone who expected an honest answer and would wait without impatience for it. She thought about apoptosis, about cells that end themselves to make space, about the things she had watched die in herself over 47 days and the things that had begun, tentatively, to differentiate in the space they left. "I want to not have this be an accident anymore," she said. The first claiming was, "What happens from here is a choice." The stillness in him shifted. It was the quietest seismic event she had ever witnessed. "That works," he said. Epilogue: What the CELLS make. Kael'Vora did not become a different person. This is important to understand. She did not shed the House Kael education, the political instincts, the precise legal thinking, the warrior's posture she had been trained to from childhood. She did not stop being a princess or a strategist or a woman who had grown up learning to manage every situation as if someone were watching and assessing. She became a more complete version of the person who had always been there, underneath the management. The changes were quiet and total, the way biological changes are, invisible at the cellular level, undeniable at the systemic one. She began scheduling mornings differently, with space in them, rather than appointment from the first hour. She began asking questions in council meetings that were not already answered, rather than only asking questions for which she had prepared the answer as a strategic deployment. She began saying, "I don't know," as an opening rather than an admission. She began using the word kindness about herself, and found that it was not a liability in the ways she had been taught to fear. It was, as he had said, a strength, one that functioned differently than decisiveness or strategic capability, but that frequently arrived at better outcomes because it factored in variables that purely tactical thinking excluded. The empire did not change because of her. One princess changing is not a revolution, but one princess changing is also not nothing. It is a cell differentiating, which is how systems begin to rewrite themselves from the inside, in the way that cannot be commanded from above because it happens below the level of visibility. Davin Reth remained in the East Wing. He took on a formal role, logistics coordinator for the residential complex, which sounded small and was not, because the East Wing of the Silver Spine was where the third princess of the empire lived and worked, and logistics is another word for making things function rather than merely appear to function. He was good at it with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. He also began teaching Vethari script to the East Wing's lower-level staff who wanted to learn it, in the small library where she had seen him teaching himself. He did not announce this. He did not request permission. He simply found people who wanted to learn something useful and offered to help, and this was so clearly within the spirit of what the East Wing was becoming that no one thought to object. There was a trip to the Tessarin outer belt that she does not talk about publicly, and that he does not either, because some things are not stories for other people. She arranged it on a priority routing authorization, which meant 9 days of transit rather than 11. She had filed the travel paperwork through Veltha in the East Wing system, a pattern that had become their established method, the quiet administrative track that accomplished things without announcing them. The compound called TB Compound 17 was a labor installation the size of a small city and nearly as anonymous. Getting through its administrative intake required credentials she had technically but rarely deployed, the full seal of the second noble tier, which opened doors that most people in the empire would spend a lifetime never approaching. She had deployed it with the same brisk efficiency she brought to council meetings, and had watched the compound's administrator, a man who had clearly never in his working life been visited by anyone carrying such credentials, process her access request with shaking hands. Cam Reth was 61 years old. He had been bonded for 38 years. He had lost 11 years from the count at some point. She suspected a record irregularity from a facility transition, which was common and never corrected because correcting it would have required someone to care enough to do the paperwork. She stayed outside when Davin went into the holding room where his father was waiting. She had arranged the meeting. The meeting was not hers to be present for. She stood in the compound's visiting corridor, which smelled of recycled air and institutional cleaning solvent, and looked at the wall, and thought about the colony called Sereth IV, where 3 generations had grown a fiber crop that still fed Vethari textile production without anyone left to grow it. She thought about a family that had been distributed across the Empire's administrative structure like items in an inventory. She thought about what it meant to be the Empire's third daughter, and what it meant to stand in a labor compound and feel the specific weight of what the Empire's accounting system had treated as an inventory line. She did not know how long Davin was in the room with his father. She did not time it. When he came back out, his face was the controlled expression she recognized as him carrying something heavy in the most careful way he knew. His eyes were the seagless green that showed everything even when nothing else did. They did not speak for a while. Then he said simply, "He's alive." "Yes," she said. "He didn't know about my mother." No, she had decided this on the transit, that the news about his mother would be Davin's to carry to his father in his own time, in whatever form made sense between them. "I only confirmed active status before we came." He stood with this for a moment. Then, the compound administrator said the bonding term is open-ended, no fixed release provision. She had read this in the record. Open-ended labor terms were standard for the outer belt mining operations, a provision that meant, in practice, that release happened when the owner decided and not before. "I know," she said. "Can you do anything?" She had been thinking about this for 9 days of transit. "Not quickly," she said. "The mining compound operates under a different jurisdictional framework than domestic assignments. It has its own contracted ownership structure that requires a different kind of intervention than a free citizen designation." She looked at him directly. "But I can do something. It will take longer. I want you to know I intend to, and I want you to know the timeline is honest rather than optimistic." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's more than anyone has offered in 38 years, he said. She did not say "you're welcome," because it did not feel like the right container for what was being exchanged. She nodded instead, and they walked back through the compound's visiting corridor together, toward the transit bay, toward the 9-day journey home. The water feature in the East Garden ran all year. She had never known what sound the garden was missing until the day it arrived. There was a moment, in the late spring of that year, when Kelsira came to the East Garden for the first time since childhood, drawn by something she didn't specify and perhaps couldn't, and sat on the stone ledge next to Kael'vora and looked at the silver-leafed ground cover in the morning light. "It's changed," her sister said. "It's been tended," Kael'vora said. Kelsira was quiet for a while. "He's not what I expected." "No. What did you expect?" Kael'vora thought about the claiming pen, the collision, the claiming token that had activated by accident in a hand she hadn't been paying attention to. The tall human with seagless eyes who had looked at his collar and then at her and said, with complete directness and zero ceremony, "You didn't mean to do that." "I didn't have expectations," she said. "That might be why it worked." Her sister made a sound she couldn't categorize. "I have someone I want to introduce you to," she said. "A policy advisor from the Outer Rim sectors. She's been working on revised labor provision frameworks for the last 4 years. She would like to speak with someone in the Imperial family who might actually listen." Kael'vora looked at her sister. You're asking me to take a meeting. I'm noting that someone in the family should take it, and that you seem to have become the someone most likely to be useful. A pause that contained, she thought, the same difficult pride her mother had shown. Don't tell mother I said that. I won't, Calvera said. The water feature ran its small, continuous sound. The cells did their invisible work. The empire did not change in a day, it never did, but somewhere in its vast structure, something had begun to differentiate, to grow toward a shape that did not yet have a name. One princess, one accident, one choice made again every morning. That was how it started. That was how it always started. That was, she understood finally and completely, how it had to start. Not with a command from above, but with a change in what a single person was willing to see when she paid attention. She paid attention. She was paying attention still. End. Word count, story words estimated duration, minutes at 160 WPM.